We need to preserve it, we need to build on it, we need to deconstruct, but also reconstruct with humanity. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا مروة. أعتقد أنك وجهتي عدد كبير قوي من الأسئلة اللي أنا فاردها أمامي على قصاصات كثيرة من الورق، فوفرتي علينا. هنسمع عدد من الإجابات لكن نستمع للؤي. اتفضل.
Okay. I think my job has become very easier now. All is said and done. I just need to conclude, it seems. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be sitting with such a distinct group of people and also audience, and at this time specifically. I would like to take a little bit of a different route to what most of us are here to listen to. Most of us are here. I'm not sure if you want to hear about Mubarak and about the whatever was happening and more lessons learned into the Egyptian politics, but I'd rather to take this a little bit to a different direction. There are two things. I'm starting with from Maharaj's point that Egyptians really by this revolution, and of course Tunisia as well before us, have become somehow pioneers. The idea that this revolution comes at this information age has connotations that we should be looking into and we should be able to read into the future. So I so much very much like the spirit of this talk today, that it is not about taught lessons, that it is about lessons learned and lessons shared. And the more the sharing, the more the caring, the more that we can get out of it, hopefully better for us, and the more that we can offer something to humanity. Of course, there is reality and there is ambition. The reality is the past and the now. So now is already past. And as far as reality is concerned, we should be tending to all sorts of things that are missing in Egypt and in other countries that are revolting at the same time in the spring of freedom around the Arab world. So basically, we had nation states that went defunct, that were almost not functioning, and we had regimes that have taken advantage. And we had regimes that were taking advantage of this nation-state structures that have developed in Western political thought and have suppressed their own people in a very totalitarian way, that things have become so bad as they were. To me, and these are just reflections, of course, because we're still at the stage of observation. To me, the third millennium started just a few months ago. So, and the reason I'm saying this is that we have managed to break through the code of the nation state. You had nation states, you had regimes who were quite militant, were willing to subdue their citizens. The matter of the fact should be the reverse, that people should be, states and nation states are structures that should be serving their own citizens. This was not happening here. So I think there is a new reality for everyone that's around Egypt and around the whole world. And I think that this should be one way to look into the future and how we can take things for that. Some people are trying to learn from what they have in Western thought and also in Europe and the US, and are hastening to learn from them what they have. I'm not so sure if we should be doing this at a time that even party system and politics are declining in many places. So I'm not so sure. Democracies are good. We should have them compared to what we've had. We didn't have much. So of course we should have something, at least in nation-state building. We should have distribution of resources. We should have state penetration of society, services trickling down to citizens where they are. I mean, we had so much concentration around Cairo and the main cities, and all of this doesn't work. So basically you need to have this. But as I'm saying, that as we grapple with reality and as we try also to define the different powers in society, and each of them getting their share, whether they are the religionists or the liberals or anyone else, we should also keep an eye on the future and on our ambitions of how we can learn from the lessons of the past of this. The idea is to get to development and to get to development as fast as possible, and that is really where we should be looking into again the pioneering ideas. I don't think that we know much now, and this is why I think we should all be studying. I hope that we are not up for a second misread as what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was a bipolar world, the US and the Soviet Union, and once the Soviet Union has fell, we got into the trap of a unipolar world, and also we've seen all that happen since then. I don't rate this to be a very nice experience since the fall of the Soviet Union. I hope that this time is actually opportune to think of something different. So hopefully we will be able to draw lessons and expand on them that would not take us into that direction again. Even the idea, I mean, the thing about these revolutions is that they were able to mobilize the mass publics in a way that was unprecedented, and no one expected them. So a few months prior to the revolution, if you've asked anyone, no one would expect that the people would rise and would be able to topple the regime. And this is why also this has been taken lightly by regimes in Egypt and around the region. Of course, the regimes that went all out, like what you have now in Syria, in Yemen, and might be much more catastrophic. So in that sense, I would also like to bring the notion of, I mean, everyone knows it, of luck, that at least the Egyptian revolution and the Tunisians have been lucky until now, and I think now we need to manage our luck through this process. Because, and of course, it's not only about luck, it's about also exerting ourselves. So now we've had luck to keep us going. I think now the challenge is to put enough investments of human into the human infrastructures and also financial and infrastructures to be able to move the country forward. Even the way organization in the past has been happening because of this mass mobilizations, even the concepts of labor and how you can mobilize would be also much different into the future. So, anyways, what does all of this tell us? It tells us that the future is not like the past, not for Egypt and not for anybody else. I think there are major lessons to be drawn, and that for politics and for political thought more generally, with mass mobilization and empowerment of the individual, the citizen, in the middle of the process. In the past, the citizen was not able to reach out and get something for himself or herself. I think now the new reality is differing, and that we should not be duped into thinking in the old ways. I think that social science should also be developing to cater to that just as much as material sciences are. Just a second. And I think that we should all be studying more and reflecting in ways that we can take this to the next level, and we should not stop there. Okay, thank you.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ وائل. ربما أبدأ مع السادة المشاركين إذا ما كان لديهم، يعني سمعتم أكثر من نقطة ترغب في معرفة انطباعاتكم وتعليقاتكم عليها، وهي أيضا مرتبطة بالأسئلة التي جاءتنا. سأبدأ مع هذه الأسئلة أولا، وسأطرحها على السيد سيلسو وعلى السيد مهراج، لأنه نتحدث عن عملية ديمقراطية بدأت تظهر بالفعل ومررتم بها على مدى سنوات. سؤال عن الإشراف القضائي الكامل في مصر. على سبيل المثال نتحدث على الانتخابات، الإشراف القضائي الكامل على الانتخابات. وطارح السؤال يقول إنه اللجنة العليا للانتخابات عادة تضم شيوخ القضاة أعلى من عمر 65 سنة، وهم جميعا من الرجال، وهم جميعا ينتمون على سبيل المثال أنهم جميعا مسلمون. هل هناك تجارب مررتم بها في نوعية الإشراف على الانتخاب من خلال لجان قضائية؟ سأبدأ مع سيد سيلسو.
Well, thank you. Should I start with the comments on the discussants? Yes. Well, let me say first of all, one thing that's really struck me when the revolution in Tunisia started, since we heard it, our Tunisian friend also today, is that, well, for the last 20 years, more or less, I have been either minister or ambassador to the United Nations, with the exception of 1 year in which I was ambassador in London, which is not exactly a place which is totally isolated from the world. So in all these 20 years, I never heard one word of criticism of the Tunisian government by the same Western powers that are always criticizing other countries. So this is extremely interesting if you want to see how things goes, because the same powers that criticize so many countries, I never heard one word of criticism. And now we learn correctly what happened there. and all the facts that were once again explained here. So I mentioned that because when someone in a developed, rich country is speaking about democracy, very often is speaking about a democracy somewhere where it's a friendly way of exerting democracy. If it's not such a friendly way, it changes, and the other way around. So this is a comment that I would just like to make because of our Tunisian friend here. I was really admired. It was a big admiration for all of us what started in Tunisia. It was totally unexpected, by the way, for us, for most of the analysts. I never heard any analyst saying that, well, if there is a spark coming from somewhere, it will probably be from Tunisia. Never heard of that. And I mean, I know even, of course, I'm not an expert in the region, but in any case, it's curious. I'll try to reply very quickly to the questions put by our lady colleague, so that we also establish a gender equilibrium here, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. Questions of representation in the writing of the Constitution. You know, there is no definite answer, in my opinion. I'm just saying, you know, there's no definite answer to that. As I said, in Brazil, there was a big discussion, and again, what I'm saying is it's not that lessons cannot be drawn from experience, but it's not up for those who had the experience to tell them. But I mean, but for whatever it's worth, I'll say, there was a lot of discussion in Brazil whether we should have an exclusive constituent assembly elected only for that purpose, because they would not be representing further interests in the future. They would be free just to do that and then go home, and then we would have a normal Congress, or whether we should have a normal Congress elected by the rules that existed, which were somewhat unfair but not totally unbalanced, and then let them choose, let them do the Constitution. In the end, the country took the second option, probably because in Brazil, as many things happens, I don't know if that we owe that to our Portuguese tradition or whatever, everything happens slowly. You know, I don't know if it's good or bad, but there is this conciliation tendency, which, no, but that's the way it is. I mean, as I said, we started the transition period in '74. Argentina was not even thinking of a transition, and then Argentina had a transition much before we had. But that's how it happens in Brazil. On the other hand, in terms of costs of lives and so on, it was smaller. So, I don't know. History will tell what's better or not better. But because it was that way, we had a Congress, it was elected, and it voted as a constituent assembly with different rules in the voting itself, and that became the constitution of the country. And let us say we are not so unhappy with that. We had amendments. You always can amend the constitution. It's not so easy as writing because you require a certain bigger majority, but it's not impossible. That happened in the past when, for instance, Cardoso wanted to be re-elected, and it was not bad. Also, President Lula used the same. He didn't have to rewrite because Cardoso had already done that for him. But anyway, he was also re-elected. So it's not impossible to rewrite. On the other hand, also the constitution that was written in that way proved also to be a very flexible instrument, because Brazilian democracy was put to test very early. Because the first president who was elected directly in Brazil, we had a civilian government of 5 years, but which was still chosen with ancient rules. Then when the first elected president, elected by direct vote, he was involved, or at least it was alleged that he was involved, it's not for me to pass judgment, on a corruption scandal. And the people who were no longer in the streets came back to the streets, and somehow was a force, one of the forces which led to the impeachment of that president. Curious enough, he was not then condemned by the justice, and now he's back, he's a senator. And that's part of the, so the people gave him amnesty somehow, but he lost his job at that point. And that was a very, very strong test to Brazilian democracy, because it was just 5 years after, or 7 years after the military had left government. So that constitution, in spite of not being maybe the perfect one, proved flexible enough. You have to have this flexibility and this capacity to deal with new situations. Well, so this is one point that I mean. There is no definite answer. I cannot say what's the best. I think sometimes the best may be inimical to the possible. You have to find a way there. The second question that you mentioned was related to to justice and accountability and had to do with amnesty. Again, Brazil was a special case in a way because the amnesty came actually because we had this long transition. It doesn't mean that we didn't have fight, but it was a long transition. The amnesty came from the military themselves. They offered it there, and the big discussion was whether the amnesty would be given to everyone, including those that were accused then of terrorism or blood crimes somehow. So the big demand by the opposition was, maybe that's some similarity with South Africa, I don't know. So the big demand then was not so much whether the military or those who were in power would be judged or not, tried or not, but whether all the others who had opposed would benefit from the amnesty. And they did. So now, many years later, you have a discussion whether those that in the past had practiced crimes, such as torture, should be tried or not. And again, there is no absolute answer for that. I don't want to give mine. I think this is a very, very, very difficult discussion in Brazil because of the way the process occurred. I will just say one thing. I think the best solution, in my opinion, was the one found by South Africa with the Truth Commissions.
I think it was the worst.
Ah, well, then it will be interesting. That will be interesting. I thought it would be the best for this following reason, because you are not, let us say, forgetting about the past. On the other hand, you are not exercising vengeance instead of justice. But, of course, everything depends on how the process itself evolves. So, again, there is no definite answer, and we're still struggling with that. Recently, the Supreme Court in Brazil said that the amnesty law is there and cannot be revoked and have to be applied to everyone. But it's a continuous discussion. We still have a bill in Congress which would allow for some sort of Truth Commission. I was very brief, so give me time now. Economic policy. Well, of course, everything is changing in the world, including the IMF. I'm not speaking of the recent scandal, but in a more general way. Everything is changing, so it's possible that the IMF can give you some better advice than they used to give us in the past. I would say that Brazilian economy only recovered, and I think the same is true of the Argentinian, because we did exactly the opposite of what the IMF recommended to us. And so we insisted on growth, and we insisted on redistributive policies, which were, of course, implied big government expenditures. And that's why I think now we have a more just society, and a society in which there is greater political stability, irrespective of the party that comes to power. So that's my opinion. But since the IMF is changing, and say maybe we may have a Mexican or a Brazilian or a Chilean or an Indian or an Egyptian as head of the IMF, the advice might be different if that happens. So I don't know. Last point that you mentioned, but I'll have another comment. The question of the role of religion. I think this is very different in our region of the world in relation to yours, because it's not, I mean, of course, it's not true that everyone is Catholic in Brazil, although there was this myth. I mean, African religions were present in Brazil and were oppressed to a large extent, but it has not been an issue of that sort. And again, we had a progressive evolution, and you know, the kind of tolerance in Brazil might sound scandalous somewhere else, so I don't even would like to mention, but it's not impossible that someone would go to a Catholic Mass in the morning and to a religious African rite in the evening. That's not impossible, and he's a true believer in both. So, well, that's part of our pluralism, and that's how we are. So I'm not someone entitled to speak on religion. Of course, personally, I think as much as you keep religion, well, it's difficult to say, because I understand that in this part of the world, religion has another meaning also in terms of resistance against, let me put it in a very simple way, Western colonization or Western cultural colonization. And it didn't have that meaning in Brazil, so, or in the rest of South America. So it's a different context. But the more tolerant you may be, the better. That I will totally agree with you. Everyone should be entitled to have any job, irrespective of his or her beliefs. Unfortunately, we have been seeing very recently in Brazil the use and manipulation of religion in the political context, more or less in the way that it is used in the United States. I mean, someone is against abortion, someone is against this or that. I think this is very unfortunate. But it's not really, let us say, a religious conflict. It's a manipulation of religious beliefs in order to discredit some candidates. Well, the last point I'll just mention, which has to do with the question that you summarized, is the question of the electoral courts, generally speaking, the voting system, which I made. It's a difference between the electoral system. Our electoral system is far from perfect, and I think it has to be reformed to improve the representation that exists in Brazil. But that's another matter. But the voting system, with electronic voting, acquired such a credibility with the country that, for instance, we have governors. We have a federal system similar to the Indian or to the U.S., more like the U.S. So there were elections in which the difference was less than half of 1%, and there was no contestation. It was accepted. And it went both ways. It went pro-government or against government. So that shows that the people, whether they are right or wrong, I don't know, I think they're right, they have absolute confidence in the electoral process. And this was really a big achievement, not only in relation to the military government, but in relation to the democratic processes that existed before the military. So that's an area in which I believe other countries also, but I believe Brazil would be able to give some very practical, technical assistance.
Thank you, sir. في الحقيقة إنه تم الإجابة على أكثر من سؤال تم تقديمهم، وبالتالي في عدد كبير من الأسئلة فيما يتعلق بنقطة العفو. هأتجه للسيد ماك مهراج في هذا الموضوع، إنه متى يتم العفو؟ هل يتم العفو في أثناء مرحلة التحول أو بعد الانتهاء من الوصول لآليات ديمقراطية للمحاسبة؟ ده سؤال مهم للسيد ماك مهراج.
You want to know from me?
Yes, sir.
You see, the first observation is that these are young people and they are living in a different world. They're putting difficult questions. But amnesty question, there is no clear answer. Because you are dismantling a power structure, and if you think that the only question is the tortures, the misdemeanors, the crimes committed in the past, and that's the end of the story, your focus is too narrow. In South Africa, our transition has had to grapple with almost intractable problems about the power structures that existed in the military, in the police, in the economy, in the justice system, you name it, across the board. And we've had all these demands. So our truth and reconciliation process is merely one component of a whole armory of instruments. And we must not exaggerate its importance nor minimize its significance, because we have countries that have not had such a process, which are more cohesive today, and yet in the same period as South Africa's transition, they went through civil wars where brother fought brother. E.g. Mozambique, they have not had the Truth Commission. And they are a more cohesive society today than South Africa is. Albi may differ because he has lived in Mozambique, you see. So fine, we'll differ on it. But the point I'm making is, if you put your money in one instrument, you have a problem. The second thing I want to say is that I hear, and I've watched, so far as I watched it on Al Jazeera, the transition, the whole episode in Egypt. How the military emerged as an acceptable intermediary at this stage. And it was not as if you had a precondition to it. It arose as part of a process. And you are now sitting at a process where some are saying stay longer and others are saying get out quicker. I think, colleagues, the question that I would leave you as instead of an answer is to say, if you follow my proposition of having everybody inside the tent so that he can mediate, then the significance is really in the concept of a constitutional state, not constitutions, a constitutional state, where the constitution is supreme, rather than the model that we had of democracy from Britain of parliamentary sovereignty. Now that's a challenging concept, because I have to live within that rule of law of the Constitution. Think about it. I hear the mechanism that you're looking at, Bill of Rights, etc. These are particular hurdles that you have to overcome as you negotiate your way through. And they are merely instruments to take you through. I know in the South African experience too, I would say if you have a great and sharp difference over a particular point in the Bill of Rights, sometimes it's better to be silent so that you can come back to it later. Otherwise, once you formulated it and a compromise, you'll have to depend on judges like Albie Sachs to help you out. And I wouldn't put my life in his hands all the time.
علي أن أنهي الجلسة لأنه الوقت أصبح مداهم جدا. عندنا دقائق قليلة باقية. هناك سؤال السيد عبد الفتاح عمر عن جزئية مهمة تشغل أيضا المجتمع المصري الآن، وهي مسألة كيف يمكن انتخاب المجلس التأسيسي لوضع الدستور عن طريق الانتخاب المباشر. كيف يمكن ضمان حدوث نوع من التوافق على كثرة المرشحين والشخصيات المتاحة لهذا المجلس.
شكرا سيدي. سأجيب عن سؤالكم، لكن إذا سمحت في دقيقة. أولا إذا نقطة أولى أريد أن أشير إليها هو أنه قال سعادة السفير أن لم يكن هنالك نقد، لم يكن هنالك مقاومة للاستبداد في تونس. هذا ربما على المستوى الرسمي بين الدول، هذا قد لا تشعر به الدول، ولكن المقاومة والتصدي للاستبداد كان واضحا، وقد دفع بعضهم الثمن باهظا بحياته بالتعذيب بالتجاوزات المختلفة، والمنظمات غير الحكومية قامت بدور كبير وعلى رأسها الرابطة التونسية للدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان. المسألة الثانية التي أريد أن أشير إليها هي مسألة الدين، وأعتقد أنه تناولنا لمسألة الدين ربما تقتضي مزيد من التساؤل، لأنما حين نطرح علاقة الدين بالسياسة أو بالدولة خصوصا فإن في الواقع نعم. أولا في تونس مثلا بدون شك الإسلام هو دين أغلبية التونسيين، لكن هنالك أقليات ويجب أن تحترم حقوقها. من ناحية ثانية حتى من بين المسلمين هنالك من يمارس الشعائر الدينية، هنالك من يمارس، وهنالك قراءات وأفكار مختلفة، أفكار تنويرية وغيرها أقل تنوير، وآراء أخرى كذلك. هذا لا يسمح بالقول أن مثلا الدين غير موجود في الفضاء العام، فهو يحتل مكانة متميزة في الفضاء العام، غير أن الحلول المشطة هي الحلول التي تهدد الحرية. الحل المشط الأول هو أن يكون الدين بيد الدولة، والحل الثاني أن تكون الدولة في يد الدين. فكيف يمكن أن نعتبر دور الدين في الفضاء السياسي الفضاء العام وحماية الحقوق والحريات والديمقراطية وكرامة كل شخص مهما كان رأيه ومهما كان توجهه؟ هنا يمكن، وفي تونس هنالك محاولة جدية وضع عدد من الضوابط حتى لا يكون الدين تعلة على الانقلاب على الحقوق والحريات وعلى الديمقراطية. ما أريد أن أشير إليه مسألة انتخاب مجلس قومي تأسيسي في تونس. هنالك لجنة مستقلة متعهدة بهذه المسألة. حينما نقول لجنة مستقلة فهي مستقلة